Well, hello everybody. Thank you for registering online. My name is Karina and I'm one of the team members at the Training Accreditation Council. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on developing units of competency for accredited courses. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. Now, I would like to introduce Cherry Hawke, who is our presenter for this webinar.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all today. The purpose of our webinar today is, of course, to scrutinise all sections of the Unit of Competency template and consider examples for each of those. And I just want to check, first of all, that you have the following documents. You should have a copy of this PowerPoint, and you should also have a copy of the Unit of Competency template, which of course is full of guidance in blue text. So at this point, to start the development of a Unit of Competency, you will already have completed a number of tasks, and I've just given you a summary of those here on the screen. You will have consulted with industry experts and other stakeholders such as RTOs, licensing bodies possibly, and potential participants. You have to have established a genuine need for the course, and of course you must retain evidence of this because you'll need it for your actual application for accreditation. You will have identified the vocational outcomes for the course in terms of the main work function that your units will address, and you will have confirmed that there are no nationally recognised units already available on the National Register, training.gov, which could be used for some or all of the required units. And of course, you will have kept detailed information of your research, especially if it shows that there are no existing units of competency. So the next two slides are just showing the components of the units of competency that we will go through one by one. There are two parts to a unit of competency: the unit itself and the assessment requirements for the unit. And this screen, of course, is showing you the components of the actual unit. These are in a single file when they're in an accreditation process, rather than in two separate parts, for example, on training.gov for training package units. This slide and the next slide just list the components, each of which we will then discuss in detail. Units of competency must be written in a standard format and contain some essential components. This promotes national consistency, helping to ensure that units from a range of training packages and accredited courses can be easily understood by various users. It also enhances recognition of competencies and the transferability and portability of qualifications, because of course you are able to import an accredited unit into a qualification on training.gov. The components of a unit of competency are set out in the template that we sent to you. The blue text under each heading indicates which components are mandatory and which components are optional. On the slide that you're looking at the moment, you can see I've marked the optional components, and everything else on the screen is mandatory. Remember, though, that once you choose to include one of those optional fields, everything in that field becomes mandatory and must be assessed. This is the second part of the unit template. Our TAC template for the unit of competency is based on the template from the standards for training packages. If you are an RTO or are working with training package units, you'll recognise the streamlined format. This format reflects the template in the AQTF 2021 standards for accredited courses, which is what we use at TAC, and Victoria also uses those. There are instructions within the template which you must follow. The accreditation review process evaluates your documents, the ones you submit, on whether or not they meet the template requirements. The assessment requirements section, which you're looking at now, has only 3 components, which you can see on the screen. The assessment conditions include requirements for assessors, not just for assessment. So the first component is the unit codes. I'm not going to read what's on the screen, but the first 3 letters must not duplicate training package codes. Some training package codes are longer, but the codes cannot exceed 12 characters all up, but we expect you to use the 9-digit alphanumeric code that you need to invent for TAC courses. There are no spaces in between the characters in the code, and version identifiers, if you've been around for a while, our codes for units of competency used to end in A, B or C. We don't do that anymore. So for accredited courses, we don't have that either. The example on the screen, the last 2 on the screen are for an advanced diploma in offshore operations, and the 3rd unit in a suite of marketing units of competency. So you can see that the code chosen for the unit is OSO to show that it's offshore operations. It's a marketing unit, so MKT has been used for the next 3 digits. And then there's 2 options you can use. You can either use a 6 to show that it's in an advanced diploma, so you would code it 603. Otherwise, you would just code it 003. And you've got that option in the TAC accredited courses. The qualification code, which we're not looking at here, but the qualification code is actually assigned by TAC, so you should not try to apply a code at qualification level. We're only asking you to designate codes for your units. And again, this is a TAC requirement. This is not a national requirement. National codes are actually organised for you. The next component in our unit of competency are the unit titles. And again, I'm not reading what's on the screen, so if you have questions about that when I finish telling you the rest, please put a question in the chat box. The unit title must represent a work outcome or the outcome of a work function. It is not a task or a process. We want you to avoid justification or purpose statements, so keep it clean and simple. Avoid acronyms in the title of a unit of competency. There are exceptions to that, like WHS for work health and safety, but otherwise don't make up your own acronyms, and don't use ampersands, dashes, slashes, colons, semicolons, or full stops. We try also to avoid terms that are open to interpretation, and that includes terms like appropriately, relevant, various, a range of. We don't put those as the title of a unit of competency, because we want it to be a very concise outcome. We don't include terms that are not directly accessible. So in terms like understand something, recognise something, or consider something which happen inside your head, we don't use those as the title of a unit of competency. The example on the screen, which is linked to our previous slide, also shows a correct unit code, which is the OSO MKT 603, evaluate strategic marketing outcomes. So you can see it's short, clean, very concise. The next component in our unit of competency is the application section. Don't write this section as if it was a curriculum to be taught. Do not use the unit applies to students. We're talking about the graduates, not the students who are actually going to do the course. Even for knowledge-based units, the focus is on the application of the unit by those who have achieved it, not on the learning or training that they will undertake. We want you to use consistent lead-in wording in the units so that all your units will be similar. For example, the template suggests that the unit descriptor commences with this unit describes the performance outcomes, skills and knowledge to, and for our marketing unit, it might be to evaluate strategic marketing opportunities in order to establish a clientele of offshore companies. For the summary of unit outcomes, commence with the unit covers so that it's nice and clean. And that's really a summary of the elements. And finally, for the application information, which is at the end of this section, commence with this unit is applied by, remember that it's graduates, who do the following in the workplace. Our next component, which is one of our optional fields, is the prerequisite units field. Some developers prefer to keep this prerequisite field and to indicate that the unit has no prerequisites. So they would have either write this unit has no prerequisites, or they would simply write nil. The people who do this tend to have prerequisites elsewhere in the course structure. If you do include prerequisites in your course, then they must be as part of the course, because they must be able to be completed as part of the course. Prerequisites do create a barrier to entry and to the flexibility of your delivery, so you should avoid them if possible, or minimise them at the best. If one aspect of a previous unit is essential, it may be better to include that aspect within your unit rather than making it a prerequisite. By definition, prerequisites are units of competency, so you can't specify a qualification as a prerequisite, but of course you can specify it as an entry requirement for the course. The next two fields which are optional are the competency field and the unit sector field. The competency field is sometimes used in accredited units of competency, but don't use it if there's only one unit in the field. You can still code a single unit to reflect the content, but using the row for competency field implies to the users that it's more than one unit in that field. In terms of the unit sector, it's rare to find the unit sector used for accredited units of competency, as all units tend to be in the same industry sector, so we don't need further categorisation. Or they are cross-sector, so identifying a single industry area is not applicable. So we very rarely see that particular field used. Next one, the elements. We want a coherent, logical structure for your elements, so they are written in the order that you would expect the work to be done in the workplace. Again, there are a number of things to avoid here. Avoid putting in optional or alternative requirements. Don't use if applicable, and don't say do this or do something else. Even if it's if applicable in the workplace, in terms of the unit of competency, someone has to be able to do it in order to do it when it's applicable. So in the units, we include it as a requirement. Don't include very specific requirements, such as a particular brand of equipment or commercial software. Don't include purpose or context requirements. These belong in the performance criteria. Don't use personal pronouns, you or your. So you wouldn't write build your business, you would put build the business. Keep them generic. We avoid imprecise requirements. So we don't put things like apply knowledge of, which is not directly accessible. If you wanted to write this, you would ask yourself, what would I see the person do if they were applying knowledge of? And that's what you would write instead. And there's a couple of examples on the screen, and you'll notice one has got an acronym in it, and that's to undertake a SWOT analysis. But again, it's a bit like WHS. It's actually very well known and too cumbersome to write it out in full. So that's one of the occasions where an acronym would be accepted. The second one, archive and delete documents. You can see it's the same principle as writing the title for your unit. We're trying to be concise and specific and write it as an outcome. The next component in the unit of competency, performance criteria. The performance criteria must include evaluative statements that specify not only the performance to be assessed, but also provide a required standard of performance for the element to which they relate. We don't expect you to write a standard performance for every single performance criteria, but you should have at least one within the set that you've got for a particular element. You need to specify the required performance in roles, tasks, and skills. These performance criteria do reflect applied knowledge where this is required for competent performance. We still expect them to be concise in expression, reflect the complexity of the actual unit. So requiring someone to attend meetings in a unit for supervisors and managers rather than leading a meeting or contributing to complex problem solving is what you would expect to see in performance criteria. Don't use terminology that's open to interpretation by different assessors, for example, relevant and appropriate, and don't use terminology that is not directly accessible. So it's the same rule as for the title: recognise, consider, and so on, things that happen inside a person's head and you can't actually observe. And make sure that your performance criteria isn't just a repeat of the element. So back in the day when we used to write them in passive voice, someone would say, do the work, and then they would say as their performance criteria, the work has been done. So we don't do that. We actually have to work out some performance criteria that relate to it. Don't use personal pronouns. Try to avoid overly detailed requirements that waffle on and on. Avoid simply providing a list of tasks. Try to avoid specifying particular products rather than a more general description so that it has some longevity when something gets changed. And they must be written in sentence case, no bold, underlined, or italic fonts. Now, this applies to people who are rewriting units of competency that have been accredited a long time ago and would have included that sort of information in the old format. And the example on the screen, of course, assist clients to access resources that address their needs. And if you'd only written assist clients to access resources, you wouldn't have had a standard of performance. But in this one, the standard of performance is that the resources they access do address their needs. The next component is, of course, the foundation skills. And there's a definition up there for you. But remember that only some foundation skills will occur in a unit of competency. Don't feel compelled to adjust the work function to include additional foundation skills that are not really essential to performance of that work function. Some training packages use the Australian Core Skills Framework or the Australian Core Skills for Work, and some identify levels and even performance variables from those frameworks. And the Defence Training Package does this, or did this, but there is no requirement excuse me, in the standards to use these frameworks, and certainly not to include levels. Remember that everything in a unit of competency must be assessed, and vocational assessors are not trained to assess whether a person meets the levels in these frameworks. So it's not wise to follow this particular course of action. The next slide is also on foundation skills, how they are included. We want you to try and write your foundation skills as performance criteria for the element where they apply. Don't include foundation skills that have no link to the performance criteria. Be wary of including foundation skills for reading and learning, as these are often used incorrectly. For example, reading. If performance criteria require a person to access the internet, identify multiple sources of information, extract the key messages from a source, or critically analyse and report findings, then reading complex documents doesn't need to occur as a foundation skills in a table, because you've already assessed it. You will have assessed it by assessing all of those complex requirements. And also, you would be obliged to assess their reading ability, which is not what the context of the unit requires. It actually requires those outcomes that I just identified. In the learning section, just because a student will be learning something by doing the unit doesn't mean that learning is included in the unit unless the unit actually requires the learner to plan and manage their own learning, or to acquire and apply practical strategies that facilitate their own learning. Just because they've learned something, it doesn't mean you're teaching them how to use their learning skills. Please don't copy foundation skills table formats from training package units. Some of the training package units contain tables that list the foundation skills that are in the performance criteria. The table is meant to only list those ones that are not overt. So if you do that and you put in some into the national template, those people have actually changed the text in the template. So we want you to actually follow the requirements of the template and only identify foundation skills that you weren't able to identify as part of the performance criteria. The next one, again, is an optional field, the range of conditions, and it's often not used in accredited units. You can see the example on the screen there, and it's a must-have. So this field specifies different work environments and conditions that affect performance. The essential operating conditions are included. The range is restricted to these conditions and any other variables essential to the work environment. And it's only really used because when it is used, everything in it is mandatory and must be assessed. The unit mapping is our next component in the last component in the unit of competency side of the template. There are two possible formats for this particular one, which you are free to use. The two of them are on the screen for you there. A new course often just uses the second format because it's the first time the unit's being written, but that second format can also be used when units are superseded. In this case, you would write in the information under it, you would say this unit supersedes and is equivalent to the previous unit with its code and title, or you'd say this unit supersedes and is not equivalent to the previous unit, code and title. So now the next sections of the unit are the assessment requirements. And the first component within the assessment requirements, of course, is the performance evidence requirements. This has elements. This will say the elements and performance criteria, range of conditions must be assessed. This section doesn't simply repeat them, although there must be a direct relationship between what you put in here and the unit itself. Because of the requirement for a direct relationship, nothing new can be introduced here that is not already included in the unit. This section provides the opportunity to specify how much evidence is required and/or how often performance must be demonstrated in order for a decision to be made on whether or not a person has achieved competency. And you can see on the screen, it talks about specifying the volume, how much, or the frequency, how many times, how often. Requiring someone to demonstrate the ability to do something is not the same as an individual actually doing it. So even though training packages quite often use that terminology, we prefer you to write a much more carefully crafted lead-in statement. For example, to achieve competency in this unit, a person must satisfy the requirements of the elements, performance criteria, and foundation skills of the unit. And if you've included a range of conditions, you would put that in as well. And then you would carry on and you would simply say the person must also, and then you'd have a list of dot points. A person must also prepare a response to at least one request for tender. The person must also facilitate at least 2 management meetings. These are from different units, of course. Another example, the person must also prepare a flowchart of the project management process from initiation to closeout. And you can see that some of those are products. So they are actually preparing a flowchart, which is preparing a product, which then is assessed by the assessor, or it's a performance outcome, which is facilitate at least 2 management meetings, which must be observed then by the assessor. So the performance can be actual performance that someone's going to observe, or it can be a product that people have to actually produce, which then is assessed. And the performance is the production of that product. In the performance evidence section, this is where you set out the boundaries for required performance. providing specific, well-defined performance tasks that are confined to the units and not broad skill requirements. So you're not going to say one of the performance requirements is have good communication skills. If you include a requirement to meet the dimensions of competency, those dimensions must have appeared in the actual unit. Otherwise, someone including those dimensions in their assessments, for example, manage contingencies when it isn't in the actual unit, will have provided an invalid assessment. So we want our assessments to be valid and assess everything in the units of competency, so you make sure that what you put in the performance evidence requirements has a link back there. So some training package units list all of the dimensions of competency as a requirement. We suggest that you only, if you're going to list those and say task skills and task management skills, fine, as long as that is part of the unit. But if you've got no contingencies in there, don't put it in. Please don't include knowledge in this section. You'd be surprised how many times we have knowledge written in this particular section. So on to the knowledge section. The knowledge will relate directly to the performance criteria and, of course, the range of conditions if that's present. Don't include broad areas of knowledge because it must be actually confined to the unit of competency. Be careful not to include the same knowledge across multiple units. So, for example, if there's a whole framework that applies to the units, for example, the early years learning framework for early childhood education units, you wouldn't just write the fact that the framework is required as knowledge for each and every unit. You would specify the part of the framework that applies to the unit that you're talking about. Again, use a consistent lead-in statement. For example, to achieve competency in this unit, a person must demonstrate knowledge of, and just list the knowledge in dot point format. Don't lose sight of the lead-in statement when you're writing the knowledge. Everything must flow from your lead-in knowledge of. So if you say awareness of as one of your dot points, then it doesn't work because the lead-in is knowledge of, and now it says knowledge of awareness of whatever. So you need to keep looking back at that lead-in statement when you're writing it. So some examples might be knowledge of key provisions of legislation, codes of practice, national standards, and for our marketing unit, it would be affecting offshore marketing operations. So we don't leave it open and simply say key provisions of legislation, codes of practice, and national standards. We make sure it relates to the actual unit. Another example, knowledge of, which is the lead-in, knowledge of risk factors and mitigation strategies for offshore marketing opportunities, for example. Contraindications for cognitive behaviour therapy treatments might be another example. And the one on the screen, developmental milestones for children 0 to 5 years of age. So you're writing the unit and you want developmental milestones and that's all you write? No, you don't just do that. You say children 0 to 5 because you want to be very specific about the milestones that you actually want covered. Please don't include performance in this particular section. So the assessment conditions, which are the next section that we're looking at, again, this is mandatory. So only look at assessment strategies, methods and tools. We don't include them here unless they are actually mandatory. Don't include redundant information that's already mandated within the standards for RTOs. Only RTOs can deliver these units, so it's not necessary to, for example, cite the principle of assessment or the rules of evidence as an assessment condition, because that's already understood. If there are no industry mandated assessment conditions, it is acceptable to note this here if you need to. You don't just leave it blank, so you might actually say that there are no mandated conditions that are required. And you can see that you can also include unacceptable methods. So, for example, even though people might practice in a simulator landing a plane, you can't actually assess them just using their simulator. Some examples might include students must have access to legislation, regulations, standards and codes on international marketing. That's my marketing unit. Students must have access to materials, tools and equipment, including PPE required for tool setting. So you can see again the conditions are specific to the unit. Assessment must occur in a workplace or simulated workplace that replicates workplace conditions. That's the one on the screen. And note that these units all use must. They must be, must occur, must have access to. Don't use the word should, because should doesn't actually mean that it's mandatory. And we've had people actually have should in there, and then an RTO in delivering it chooses not to use it because you should do it, but you don't actually have to. Assessment related items in this section must be consistent with the assessment requirements that you describe in your accredited course document, which is part of one of the documents that you must develop as part of your application. And in section 6.1, it actually asks you about assessment. And so whatever you put in these units should be consistent with whatever it says in the accredited course document. And people often write the accredited course document after they've done all the units, so they can actually reflect what's going on. This section also has the assessor requirements, and again, this must be consistent with section B, 6.2 of the accredited course document. In the template, in the blue text, in the unit of competency template, it has suggested default statements here. And the default statement for assessors is, assessors must satisfy the assessor requirements in the standards for registered training organisations current at the time of assessment. And we've done that to try and have some longevity. So we don't actually mention the standards for RTOs in capital letters 2015, because we know jolly well that they change, and of course they're about to change. So if you're writing units now, we suggest writing standards for registered training organisations in lowercase, so that you're not referring to a particular set of standards. And if you say current at the time of assessment, then it'll last for the current standards and the new standards when they come in 2025. If there are requirements additional to the requirements of the standards for RTOs, and we often have this in accredited courses because we're looking at niche areas, very specific areas, and sometimes they need a highly qualified assessor. So you're able to actually identify that in your units. For example, you would write the default statement, and then you would put, in addition, assessors must have a minimum of 5 years industry experience in whatever it happens to be. There's an example from the from training package units, which is for the white card, for example. It says assessors must hold a unit CPC CWHS 2001. So the unit of competency, work health and safety, which is a level higher, is required by assessors in order to deliver the white card, which is the CPC WHS 1001. And so that's a requirement. And a lot of hospitality units talk about the experience that a chef must have, and that it must relate to the units of competency, to the unit of competency. So you can't just say I've been a chef for 3 years. If you're going to deliver a patisserie unit, you have to say 3 years experience in patisserie. So that's your opportunity here to be very specific about what you're going to actually include. Now the next screen actually is putting it all together. So once you've developed your first unit of competency, of course you repeat the development process for each and every unit as you go through. And here again, you must consult. So you consult now to determine which units of competency apply to everyone, and these will give you your core units. If you have anybody who doesn't, for example, if you're doing competencies and you're expecting them to be delivered across the different states and territories, you might find out that in one state and territory it's compulsory, in another state and territory it's not, or in the others it's not. And so you would then make it an elective, because a particular state or territory, a particular department, a particular organisation can make an elective unit compulsory for their particular student cohort. They just advertise that that's what you have to do. In fact, a lot of organisations, RTOs, just determine all the electives and that's all they offer. So make sure that for a core unit, it is something that would be required by everybody, and all industry people agree that it would be required by everybody. Otherwise, you make it an elective. You then need to determine how many units altogether will be required, and that will then provide you the packaging rules. And so you will then say, well, you need this many core units, this many electives, and a total of this many units is required. Your packaging rules, of course, will be more complex if you've grouped your units of competency into areas, and in which case your groups will be numbered A, B, C, and then you might say, 2 units from Group A, no units, or as many units as you like from Group B, and so on. You then need to work out the course hours. So you assign nominal hours to each unit. This is the time it would take to train someone with no prior knowledge, which is your structured training. If you're using imported units from training packages, then you must use the nominal hours guides to actually provide those units in your accredited course document, but you're required to identify the nominal hours for each and every unit that you develop. And again, you use industry consultation to do this. You check the total nominal duration for the core plus the hours that you've assigned for your electives, and this gives you the course duration. And again, this goes into section B in 1.2 of your accredited course document. You need to then check the complexity of the course against the AQF descriptors. And there may be some units of competency that do come from qualifications at a higher or a lower level, but the majority of your units will align to a qualification at a particular AQF level. And some people start their development of their course by deciding that they're going to develop a certificate 4. And if you've done your job well and reflected the industry requirements, this is the point at which you suddenly discover that you've actually got a diploma, or alternatively a certificate 3. But remember, you're meant to be consulting with industry, and you're meant to be meeting the AQF. So whatever it is what it is, unless you go back and you go, actually, we dumbed some of these things down and we expect more than that. But again, this is all in consultation with your industry. You also consider the period over which the course should be provided, whether it's a year, 18 months, 2 years, 6 months. Work out how many weeks you think it would be in total for the students, and what time commitment per week you would expect students to make in their own time. The total of this will be the non-structured additional time, not supervised, that students are expected to spend. And again, you're looking at students who have no prior knowledge, unless you've decided that the cohort for your unit are very experienced people. You need to then work out the volume of learning. You will add your structured units that you've already worked out to the non-structured units, non-structured hours that the students will need to spend in their own time. And we give you in the template that little formula which says the nominal duration plus the unstructured time gives us the volume of learning. And we expect you to actually show how you got that. The difference is, of course, that the nominal hours are done unit by unit, but the unstructured time in their own time is just done at qualification level. And so you actually are working out the volume of learning for the qualification. You're not working it out, doesn't apply to an individual unit of competency. So you certainly don't have to work out the expected time in their own time for units. You do that later. Then you compare this with the typical volume of learning for the AQF level you've determined, and if it's in the ballpark, you're good to go. If it's significantly more or less, make sure you can justify this based on the existing skills and knowledge of your intended student cohort, as this will be necessary to justify when you're completing the accredited course document. And then, of course, you have to complete the remaining application documentation to go with your units of competency. So you'll complete an ACC1 application for accreditation or reaccreditation, and you will also complete an accredited course document. Put that together with your units and collate all of your evidence of industry consultation, validation, support for the course, and then you'll be ready to submit. One thing that people are not aware of is if you are just going to develop a single unit of competency, you still have to do an accredited course document, because we can't actually accredit a single unit. We accredit it as a course in whatever the unit represents. So quite often we do have individual units of competency required because things are missing from training packages, but there's not enough to do a whole accredited course for yourself. So you just want a single unit, but it will be accredited as a course in whatever the content is. And it will contain 1 unit of competency, and you'll notice that there are a lot of course in documents on training.gov, and they will contain 1 or more units of competency. Okay, now the next slide is just the resources that are available to you. We encourage you to use the ideas, of course, that you've got from your accreditation application for your next accreditation application. And we do refer you to these resources which are available for you. And some of those I've just mentioned. You can see there's an accreditation application process flowchart that you can use, which shows you the accreditation application process. And there's the other couple of documents that I mentioned. There's also a qualification template that you can use, which is optional. It's quite convenient because otherwise people have to use the entire accredited course document to work out what the rules for the course are. So more and more we're seeing that people are developing a qualification using the qualification template, because then that replicates what you see on training.gov. Okay, and we also, of course, refer you to the following on the next slide. Following links on the next slide. So here we have the link to TAC. We also recommend that you can follow TAC on LinkedIn, YouTube, or of course sign up for TAC Talks or to receive the TAC update newsletter from time to time. And we encourage you to complete the feedback survey. You can see the link on the screen for you to follow. TAC is continuously improving its education program, and one way to do this is through your feedback. So we do appreciate you taking the time to complete the survey. Remember, if you think of something after the session, please feel free to actually send it into TAC, and we can get back to you. Otherwise, thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you next time. I should say that if you're interested in the course accreditation process, there is also a webinar on that coming up in January. Thank you, everybody.